Good evening, Horizon House. Welcome to our program. I'm Sally Wren, Chair of the Diversity Awareness, and we're delighted to have this wonderful program for you tonight. I always like to start by acknowledging those who were there before us and cleared our path, but especially the Duwamish, upon whose land we stand. And tonight, Bill will introduce our co-chair, Bill Kepper, his wonderful program he has brought to us. So thank you, Bill.
Well, our guest tonight is David Armstrong, the author of this very fascinating book called Broadway Nation: How Immigrant, Jewish, Queer, and Black Artists Invented the Broadway Musical. David is I need to put my glasses on, I guess. David is the writer, producer, and host of the popular podcast Broadway Nation. Over 200 episodes been done to date, and has been heard by over 300,000 people around the world. David is also an affiliate lecturer at the University of Washington School of Drama since 2019, and he teaches a course on the Broadway musical. Armstrong has worked as a director, producer, playwright, choreographer at leading theater companies across America, as well as on and off Broadway. He is best known for his work at the Fifth Avenue Theater here in Seattle, where he was, from 2000 to 2018, served as the artistic director and executive producer, and during his tenure, Fifth produced 19 new musicals. 9 of them went to Broadway, including Disney's Aladdin, A Christmas Story musical, and 2 Tony Award-winning Best Musicals, Hairspray and Memphis. So let's welcome to the stage David Armstrong.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Hello. There we go. Just took a minute. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be here. I always felt like Horizon House was a adjunct of the Fifth Avenue Theater during the time I was there, because there was always so much back and forth between the Horizon House and the Fifth Avenue, and then we had a number of people associated with the Fifth Avenue who came to live at Horizon House over the years. So it's just been wonderful to be here and have such a big crowd. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, my first question is, what was the inspiration and the impetus for this book?
So when I left the Fifth Avenue in 2018, the University of Washington invited me asked me if I would be interested in teaching a course on the history of the Broadway musical. And of course, I was interested in doing that. But then I had to figure out how I was going to do that. It's a big subject. You can see it's a pretty big book. And it's more than 120 years of history involved in it. So I had to figure out exactly how I was going to do that. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of the ways the book is structured, which is started with me figuring out how to teach a course, a 20-lesson, 10-week course, 2.5 hours twice a week at the University of Washington. I teach a large lecture class, 100 students. It's been really rewarding to do that. And then when we got to COVID and the pandemic, I knew we were going to have to teach remotely. I usually only teach in spring quarter and summer quarter. So I had a little bit of warning that this was coming. And I had already had this idea in my head that there would be a good idea to take my lectures and sort of boil them down and make a more general audience friendly podcast out of it. So that was already in my head. And I thought, well, if I start making those podcast episodes, I can then use them to teach when we're not in person, when we have to do it remotely. So that started that. So in the podcast, then I published really at the same time as we started teaching remotely. And I still use those podcasts as part of my teaching, even though we're back in person doing it, because they've been so effective. So this is a long story, but I'll try to wrap it up. After the first season of the podcast, which was basically not a verbatim version of this book, because the book didn't exist yet, but basically covered the same subject matter as the book over 100 episodes or so. And I thought, well, what am I going to do now to continue the podcast? I've gotten to the end. I've got up to today, at that moment, of the history of the Broadway musical. But I knew there were a bunch of other authors out there writing really amazing books on specific subjects of the history of the Broadway musical. So I started inviting them to be guests on my podcast. That turned out to be very successful and really helped me so much later when I went to write the book, because I had met so many authors and become friends with them, really, who had already gone through this process. And then the best thing that ever could have happened is my publisher, with Methuen and Drama, which is an imprint of Bloomsbury. If you're in the theater business, Methuen and Drama has been around for more than 100 years publishing plays. It's a really established, well-known publisher. They called me, and because I had interviewed many of their authors on my podcast, they knew about my podcast, they knew about my course that I was teaching, and they asked me if I would be interested in writing a book, because they thought there was a place for a new textbook that would be used in universities to teach the history of the Broadway musical, especially through this specific lens. And the subtitle of my course at the University of Washington is very similar to this: How Immigrant, Jewish, Queer, and Black Artists Invented the Broadway Musical. And that was, music to my ears, to be invited to then, and so then I spent 2 years of my life writing this book, which I loved every minute of it. I would not recommend writing a 365-page book as your first book if you're thinking about writing a book, but I didn't know any better. And so I just plunged ahead and could not be happier with the result of it.
Well, you've kind of answered several of my questions, but this is a big subject, and it covers more than a century of history. How did you organize it? How is the book structured?
So that was the hardest part, is figuring out how to analyze this history and break it down and divide it into teachable and writable sections, things you could talk about. And what was surprised me is that among historians, among people who write about the Broadway musical, there are very few agreed upon eras or time periods that everybody says. For example, most books you will read, or people just talking about it, will talk about the golden age of Broadway. You've probably heard that expression, the golden age of Broadway, or the golden age of the Broadway musical. What's weird, though, is that almost nobody agrees on exactly when that started or when it ended or if it ever happened at all. So I thought, well, I have to tie that down. At least for my purposes, I'm not saying everyone has to agree with my determination, but I had to figure out when did that happen so I could talk about it and write about it. So I started there in some ways to think, well, how does that affect this whole history of the Broadway musical? And I ended up dividing the subject matter into several different eras. First, I talk about the precursors to the Broadway musical, everything that came before the Broadway musical, but contributed to it. These are things like Gilbert and Sullivan, operettas, so many different kinds of things, vaudeville and burlesque and Tin Pan Alley, or things that were happening as show business was emerging at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. There really hadn't been any show business before that, but partly because, with so many factors, a lot of it having to do with immigration and suddenly New York City becoming this big, giant city, there was a need for show business. And that started it. And I'll probably talk more about that later. So that's the first section. And then I talk about what I call the Genesis period, which is when the musical is finding itself. People say, what was the first Broadway musical? There is no first Broadway musical. It sort of just evolves almost like evolution. It happens along the way. But it starts in the 1890s. And by the time it sort of solidifies by the time we get to the next era, which is what I call the Silver Age of Broadway. And I'll tell you why I called it that. But this Genesis period is when there's people like George M. Cohan and other names that you would know are inventing the Broadway musical, making it up out of pieces of other things that happened before, but really for the first time creating this thing we call the Broadway musical, including many Black artists who I'll talk about in a moment. Many people will tell you that the golden age of Broadway stretches from the 1920s into the 1960s. Well, to me, that just seemed like way too long a period. And also, smack in the middle of that, the Broadway musical changes dramatically. So I thought, well, it can't be the same thing. So that's why I decided to call everything before the early 1940s, really before the opening night of Oklahoma, is what I call the Silver Age. That's the 1920s and the 30s predominantly. And then everything from opening night of Oklahoma on, I call the golden age of Broadway, up to the opening night of Hair in 1968, which then kicks off the modern era of Broadway. So what I was looking for was the turning points. When did the form change? Just like if you're talking about art history, when did the Impressionists come in and do something that hadn't been done before? When did the way art was made change? So that's what I was looking at. When did the Broadway musical change? And that sort of helped define the eras for me. Now, I agree with some people when they talk about the whole thing being the golden age, because if you're just talking about the songs, you're talking about the Great American Songbook. That absolutely starts in the 20s and goes into the 60s with just, great song after song that you cannot, walk into a Starbucks without hearing. We still hear those songs everywhere, whether they're Gershwin or Cole Porter or Rodgers and Hart, all the way through. But what's interesting is during that Silver Age period, say from 1919 to 1941, there were 300 Broadway musicals that opened. Exactly one of them is ever produced regularly today. But many of them, hundreds of the songs that came from them are still sung all the time today. So that's why I call it the Silver Age. It's still got a great deal to contribute that we still remember and we still love and we still value. Then what changes is the emphasis goes to the story, which is really what Rodgers and Hammerstein and other people, they weren't the only ones who were trying to make this happen, but there was a world of people who were thought there was something missing from the Broadway musical, and they started to put the focus on the story and the characters, and that's, for me, what makes the Golden Age the Golden Age. And and the difference there is there's hundreds of shows from that period that are still produced all the time. So that's why one is silver and one is gold for me. Then we get to the modern era, which introduces a number of new elements. I'm sure we'll get into some of that as we go on. We're still in the modern era. I sort of subdivide it with the start of the 21st century, but basically I feel like we're still in this modern era.
Well, what makes your book different from other Broadway musical histories?
There are a lot of great books that have been written before, but what I tried to do was, and there are also great books that talk about the Black artists of Broadway and the Jewish artists of Broadway. There's actually a great PBS documentary about the Jewish contributors to Broadway. All of those have been done in sort of little silos. For the first time, I believe, actually no, this is the first time I've tried to put it all together into one story, into one narrative, to tell and to show how these creative artists, whether they're Jewish or queer or African American, are all working and contributing to each other, reacting to each other. This is a continuous line from the very beginning all the way up to today, and how all those pieces fit together. And for me, that was fascinating. It's something I'd always been aware of, but as I went to start doing research, first for the course and then for the book, to figure out, to piece that story together and see how interconnected all these artists who we think about being in separate silos. We think about the black artists are working over here and the white artists are working over there, and they had nothing to do with each other, which is absolutely not the case. They were that's not how show business works. It's not how art works. Artists are always trying to interact with other artists and inspired by other kinds of art. So they're right there together.
Well, what were the biggest challenges in writing this book?
So the biggest challenge, really, there are a couple things. There's just the research was daunting, although I knew a lot about the subject matter. I have a 40-year career in the professional theater, but I was not a historian, only an amateur historian prior to this. And so delving into the actual research and making sure I could document all of that was in some ways the hardest part. And in fact, the thing I would actually recommend to anybody who's writing a book, because I had done the course first and because I'd done podcasts and other kinds of lectures and things, I didn't have to cite any of that. So then when I go to write the book, I have to figure out, well, I know this person said this, but how do I know they said this? Where did I get that quote from? Where is that story from? So I had to go back and figure out, and luckily I have a giant library of my own, but it wasn't always it was challenging then to make sure that this would be, because this is a scholarly book. I'm very happy to say that it reads very breezily and very entertainingly. I don't particularly like academic speak. I always wonder why people have to use a $400 word when they could just use a regular word that everyone would understand. So I've written it to be very accessible, but it is very, very, the research is very thorough and everything is documented, as you can see from the index in the back. So that was, in some ways, that was the hardest part for me, was just making sure everything I knew was true and documented.
Well, I have read the book, and it is very readable.
Good. I'm happy to hear that. Yes, you won't be like, what the hell is he talking about? I don't think at any moment.
In researching the book, were there topics that you came across that surprised you, or that you didn't know much about previously?
So many things. And again, because I thought I knew a lot, and I did know a lot, but there was so much I didn't know. Probably the best example, and I could quote examples from all different aspects of the book, but the thing I really was almost entirely aware of, because it's missing from our history to a great extent, is starting in the 1890s, there is an entire decade of black musicals on Broadway, created by black artists, directed by African Americans, choreographed by African Americans, performed by African Americans. And there's a dozen or more shows that happened in this 10-year period there. Hit shows, important hit shows that were part of the zeitgeist of that moment. And everyone who else this is at the same time that people like Irving Berlin and George M. Cohan are doing their part to invent the musical. There are these black artists also doing the same thing at the same time. And you will find that referenced almost nowhere in no book about the history of the Broadway. And blew me away. I did not know I knew some of the names of the people, but I didn't really know hardly anything about these shows. And that there was how influential they were. Actually, I have a little section here I can read in that regard. So some of the people who are involved in this period, again, this starts in the 1890s, are names you might have heard, like Williams and Walker, Burt Williams and George Walker. They were a very famous vaudeville team, black vaudeville team, and they were instrumental in taking their vaudeville act and evolving it into early Broadway musicals. There's another gentleman named Bob Cole, who can be credited really with producing the first black musical on Broadway. He's had sort of a rival in the business called Will Marion Cook, who had the second musical just a couple months later. This is, again, in 1895, I think their shows are happening, or 1896, I believe. So these are shows, and most of Broadway in this period is shows would run a couple months and then they would tour for years around the country. So this is before shows on Broadway would run for years. It was mostly a touring business early on with stops on Broadway. There's a gentleman named Jesse Shipp who gets credit for being the first black director of a Broadway show with one of the shows that Williams and Walker wrote. And Paul Laurence Dunbar is also very involved in these shows. You might know him. He's a poet, better known as a quite well-known poet from the era, but he actually was a theater person who was writing musicals. And then a woman I love, George Walker's wife, Ada Overton Walker, who was the queen of the cakewalk, she was known as. She was apparently this incredibly dynamic performer and choreographer, and she gets credit for being the first black choreographer on Broadway in 1903. Okay, so those were not the only black pioneers making musicals during this period. Another important songwriting team was James Weldon Johnson and J. Rosamond Johnson. These college-educated brothers from Jacksonville, Florida, came to New York in 1899 with a dream of presenting their original operetta called Tolosa on Broadway. They had presented their musical tale. Let me just get my book a little better. They had presented their musical tale of life on a South Sea island before Jacksonville's leading white patrons the previous year and had been encouraged to take it to Broadway. James later acknowledged that going to New York was, quote, an absurd and improbable venture made possible only by our invincible faith in ourselves. That faith certainly paid off because shortly after arriving in New York City, they were taken under the wing of Oscar Hammerstein I. This is the grandfather of Oscar Hammerstein II of Rodgers and Hammerstein, who was a big producer, theater owner and producer. He was very impressed with their songs, and his subsequent recommendation opened many doors for the songwriting team. Soon they were interacting with the leaders of both white and black theater in New York, especially Bob Cole, with whom they became partners. The Johnsons' raw, youthful talent and Cole's copious experience proved to be a vibrant combination. Cole and the Johnson brothers wanted to do away with minstrel show stereotypes. Their first collaboration was titled The Shoefly Regiment, and it demonstrated what they had in mind. It told the story of a graduate of a black college, much like the Tuskegee Institute, which was founded in Alabama in 1881. Against his girlfriend's wishes, he gives up his dream of becoming a teacher to enlist in the army and fight in the Spanish-American War. Eventually, after a successful combat mission and other plot complications, he returns and marries his sweetheart. The characters in the story were smart, educated, brave, and patriotic, and significantly, the central love story was treated seriously. Before this, it was assumed that white audiences would not accept a sincere depiction of black romance. The Shoefly Regiment had a total run of almost 2 years, including a long tour and several months on Broadway, where it received mostly favorable reviews. However, at least one critic was of the opinion that black should, quote, continue to write shows of a minstrel nature and leave modern musicals to white authors. Needless to say, Cole and the Johnsons ignored that critic's advice. They went on to write several more shows that were also just as fascinating and progressive in that way. And this is 10 years prior to more than 10 years, it's 20 years prior to Shuffle Along, which most people will tell you was the first black musical on Broadway in 1921. So this was, for me, a real discovery. I just did not know hardly anything about it, and it was so much fun to research it.
Who are some Broadway creators that perhaps get more focus in your book than in most other books?
There's a number of people, certainly some, those black creators, number one. And I also try to put the focus on the women of Broadway, who are not in the title of the book because all those categories, black, Jewish, queer, include women as well. But women, although they have a less of a presence as women in any venture in the early 20th century or throughout the 20th century would have, they had a presence from the very beginning and throughout, a much more significant presence than they're given credit for or they're generally acknowledged for. Women like, a name you won't know, Dorothy Donnelly. Dorothy Donnelly, at the turn in the early 1920s, starting in the teens and then in the early in the 1920s, she directs, writes, produces, and writes the book and the lyrics for a number of giant hit shows, including The Student Prince, which is the longest running show of the 1920s. Dorothy Donnelly wrote 2/3 of that show. She wrote the music and the lyrics, or the book and the lyrics, not the music. Sigmund Romberg wrote the music. So that's an amazing career that she had over quite a long period. And then another Dorothy, this is the era of women named Dorothy. We don't have that name much anymore, but everybody seemed to be named Dorothy back then. Dorothy Fields is a name you might know. She had a 60-year career on Broadway, starting in 1925, I think I might have that date right, but in the mid-20s. She starts in the mid-20s writing songs for a review. Her first hit song is I Can't Give You Anything But Love. She continues writing, I think, more than 30 musicals over into the 1970s. She's still writing in the 1970s. Her last big hit show was Sweet Charity in 1966. So this is an amazing, and although that's a name people will recognize Dorothy Fields. There's many songs very famous songs that she wrote throughout her career, but the scope of that career is not usually pointed out or acknowledged, just how amazing it was that she was able to remain vital throughout that period. And if you think about a song like Big Spender from Sweet Charity, how cool and hip she could be in the 1960s, and she started in the 1920s. So her brother, Herbert Fields, is one of the great queer creators of Broadway. He writes the book and for about 30 musicals, sometimes in collaboration with a sister, but often on his own. And he's writing the books with Rodgers and Hart, Cole Porter, you name it. He works with everybody else in this period. So there's, if you don't mind, I'll do at least one more little reading here of some of these. What also amazed me was how open and out, we would say today, not out in the way we think of it today, but how open gay artists could be, especially in the 1920s, at least within the industry, not with the public, but within the industry. It was a safe place to be gay. So throughout a career spanning 30 years and 50 Broadway shows, director and designer Hassard Short, a name I doubt anybody in here has ever heard before, was constantly in demand as one of the most acclaimed stagers of both musical comedies and revues. He was called a genius of stagecraft and hailed as the master magician of Broadway. Among the theatrical innovations that Short introduced was the traveling platform. We'd call that a wagon today. You see it at the Fifth Avenue all the time. It brings scenery onto the stage, takes scenery back off the stage. It's like a little platform that rolls with on a belt. He also was the first person to get rid of the traditional footlights and replace them with spotlights mounted on the balcony rail of the theater, which is a practice still done today. Hassard Short was born in Lincolnshire, England, and ran away from home at 15 to pursue a life in the theater. His first stage appearance in London was in 1895. By 1901, he had become successful enough that Charles Frohman, another significant gay producer, one of the biggest producers in Broadway history, brought him to New York, where he achieved great success as an actor portraying what he called silly-ass Englishmen. Apparently, he did this so effectively that these kinds of roles became known as Hassard Short parts. Meanwhile, Short began staging special fundraising performances, and it was at one of these, an all-star event in support of the Actors' Equity Union strike in 1919, which established the union, that quickly led to his first directing job on Broadway, a play with music called Honeydew in 1920, which ran an impressive 249 performances. As a result, Short soon became a key collaborator with Broadway's top talents. During the 1920s, Short staged 3 editions of Irving Berlin's Music Box Revue, the Kern-Harbach-Hammerstein smash hit Sunny, starring Marilyn Miller, the Greenwich Village Follies of 1925, and a show titled Hassard Short's Ritz Revue. So even by 1925, his name is above the title as a reason you should go see the show, because he's doing it. Short was especially acclaimed for his staging of 4 spectacular revues in the early 1930s. The first 2 had scores by the songwriting team of Dietz and Schwartz, Three's a Crowd in 1930, and which featured what critics acclaimed as a breathtaking staging of the song Body and Soul, and The Bandwagon in 1931, starring Fred and Adele Astaire, in which Short reportedly used the first revolving stage. It was not actually the first revolving stage, but it was so effective people thought it was. It actually goes back to kabuki in Japan. They had revolving stages, but his 2 shows by Irving Berlin, Face the Music and As Thousands Cheer in the mid-1930s, included what critics called masterpieces of lighting and color control, especially in regard to his staging of that second show's first act finale, Easter Parade. Short's productions were as lavish and spectacular as any Ziegfeld Follies, but were designed and executed with such impeccable taste and attention to detail that they, quote, made Ziegfeld's extravaganzas seem old-fashioned and garish by comparison. Short often traveled to Europe with his close collaborators, Moss Hart and Irving Berlin, accompanied by Berlin's family, and they went in search of inspiration and new ideas for their productions. Like all major celebrities of the period, their comings and goings were avidly covered by the press in the theater news and gossip columns of the day. But what the reporters declined to mention, even though they most certainly knew what the score was that Short was always accompanied by his life partner, William Billy Ladd, a slender, bleached blonde former chorus boy who performed in 3 musicals directed by Short. Regarding their relationship, Mrs. Irving Berlin would later remark, "Well, I disapproved, but as time went by, I couldn't help noticing that theirs was the happiest marriage of the group." Mine accepted, of course. Hassard Short was likely the model for Julian Marsh, the openly gay British Broadway director character in Bradford Rope's 1932 novel 42nd Street, from which the 1933 film musical and the 1980 stage musical were adapted. And it's clear, this is a remarkable novel, I highly recommend reading them. It's clear that Ropes also used Billy Ladd as the inspiration for the character Billy Lawler, the character in the novel who is Marsh's bleach blonde boyfriend. Their homosexuality and relationship is made abundantly clear in the novel, but was reduced to only a slight subtext for Marsh in the film, and both characters were reconceived as decidedly heterosexual for the stage version. So this is, I find Hassard Short to be one of the great unsung geniuses of Broadway. Again, a name that was only, I knew it from reading it in books, but I hardly knew anything about him.
Before you entered academia, you had more than a 40-year career in the professional theater, including 18 years at Fifth Avenue. How have your personal experiences influenced or reflected in this book?
I mean, that was one of the in so many ways, I guess, to answer your question, is because I've worked in the theater since I was, my first professional job was when I was 18 and 19 years old, and worked consistently during that time. The show mostly deals with the most famous shows, or at least the most important and influential shows. It's not a book about the flop shows that we don't know about. It's about shows that meant something to the history of Broadway. I probably, over my career, have staged or produced or been involved with 100 of those shows. So I know how these shows go. Not the original productions, obviously, but I know Guys and Dolls. I know Hello Dolly. I know these shows inside and out. So that was in a way that maybe academics might not have that same experience with them. So that was very helpful. And I think I bring a lot of that to the book. So that it was to draw on that experience. And because throughout my career, I've always been interested in the history of Broadway. If I was doing a production of The Music Man, I would research The Music Man, and I always enjoyed the research part of it. I love delving into the history, finding about the authors, Meredith Willson in that case, who's an amazing man. Are you asking a question? Okay. I'm happy to take questions a little bit. And one of my favorite chapters or sections of the book is The Music Man and West Side Story happen in the same year, and they battle it out at the Tony Awards for which one's going to win Best Musical. And I had great fun in writing that particular chapter. And what's interesting is you wouldn't think it, but those shows have so much in common with one another. And that was really, and part of that came from my personal experience. The other part of it, and this, ages me a bit, maybe for all of us in this room, because I know many of you will have been there, is because of my experience with Fifth Avenue Theater and because we had the opportunity to create musicals, to do the world premiere of so many shows, and especially with a show like Hairspray, which has entered the canon as one of the great musicals. It's now part of the history of the Broadway musical, and I got to be part of that from the beginning. I'll read this little section for you. Here we go. So Hairspray is a musical that is very dear to my heart because in 2002, it received its world premiere at the Fifth Avenue Theater in Seattle, where at the time I was serving as the producing artistic director. This provided me with a one-of-a-kind inside view of the creation and development of that show, from its first draft and early demo recordings through its staged readings, rehearsal period, pre-Broadway tryout in Seattle, and on to its thrilling opening night on Broadway. I want to emphasize what an unlikely hit Hairspray appeared to be at that time. First of all, it was based on a quirky, only moderately well-known film whose writer and director was John Waters, best known for making shockingly provocative cult films purposely intended to attack and offend middle-class values. Secondly, only one of the show's writers, co-book writer Tom Meehan, had ever written the Broadway show before, and only one cast member was of note, Harvey Fierstein, and even he had only had a limited profile outside of New York at that time. And confusingly, for potential ticket buyers, Harvey Fierstein would be playing one of the leading female roles in the show. Finally, Hairspray is a wild, wacky, irreverent comedy that revolves around some very serious issues, including body image, fat shaming, agoraphobia, racial prejudice, segregation, interracial relationships, class discrimination, and female empowerment. A combination that did not necessarily make it seem like it was going to become a big hit. Still, the producer, Margot Lyon, an incredible woman who had such a gift to me in my life to have been friends with Margot Lyon. She felt that somehow this John Waters movie could become a mainstream Broadway musical. And a series of developmental staged readings of the book and score for invited audiences made it clear that the creators were indeed onto something and had tapped into something special. And this actually started a feeding frenzy among potential investors. Their optimism was confirmed at the first preview performance in Seattle at the Fifth Avenue Theater. Some people in this room I know were there. When the audience screamed its approval after every number, and at the unforgettable third preview with 300 members of the Seattle Men's Chorus in attendance, even after the final curtain call was over and the cast had exited and left the stage, the audience refused to leave the theater. They just kept cheering and applauding until Harvey Fierstein came down from his dressing room in a robe and his wig cap for one more triumphant bow. It felt like a scene from a cheesy backstage movie musical, but it was absolutely real. I was there. And ever since, audiences have gone wild for Hairspray. So that was great fun, and I was happy that my publisher encouraged me to bring myself to it, to talk about, because those I had those experiences, and that was great fun to talk about.
Very good. One of the challenges in writing a history of Broadway musical is that time marches on, and at least to some extent, every book like this will be out of date before it is published. How did you deal with that?
I mean, that was, going into it, you go, well, that's because it's going to be a 9-month period between you hand the book in and then the book is finally published, or finally it's in people's hands. So you're going to be out of date by then. So I begged my publishers to start working on the book, but give me a little window of time to get to the 2025 Tony Awards, so that I could know what happened. And that was a year where there were a lot of women involved in shows as writers and directors. So I wanted to be able to at least, I couldn't fully report on it. And in fact, we don't know whether that's how important that will be in the history of the Broadway musical. But there were some things about it I wanted to know. So I did have a little window, probably later than ordinarily would have, to get last minute details into the book. So that, but you're absolutely right. You just know it's going to be 9 months out of date by the time it opens. Yeah.
Once you have brought the reader up to today, the final section of the book takes a somewhat different turn. Tell us about that.
This is actually my favorite section of the book. And we almost talked about making it its own book, but I'm so glad that's here because it really is a place that ties the whole book together. So what the final section I call the three principal themes of the Broadway musical. What are Broadway musicals about? And so I started doing this analysis. If you look at the hundreds of Broadway musicals that there have ever been, what are the themes that keep coming forward that so many shows are about? And I boiled it down to three particular themes. Number one, and this is almost ubiquitous with Broadway musicals, they revolve around the theme of transgressive women who do not do what society is telling them to do. And the musical celebrates them for that. And this is very different than other stories that are happening in Hollywood or later in television at the same time, where women are almost and always depicted in relationship to the man in the story as either a wife or a girlfriend or a daughter. On Broadway, almost every show, with a handful of exceptions, revolve around single working women, at least at the beginning of the story, who are rebelling against society and not doing what they're being told to do. And the show, and that goes for, they're not doing what they're being told to do in the time period that the show is set, and even in the time period when it's being produced. And yet in many of these shows, the Golden Age shows are happening in the 1950s, and yet we're celebrating these women who are completely, the audience is celebrating and the show is celebrating these women who are rejecting the values of the 1950s in many ways. It's a really fascinating sociological aspect of it, but it's absolutely true. Name an example. Pajama Game is a good example. Hello, Dolly is a good example. What was that? Annie, Get Your Gun is a great, great example. Auntie Mame is a fantastic example. Gypsy is a great example. It goes on and on and continues to today. This goes throughout the history, especially starting with the Golden Age, but even before that, this is one of the aspects. So then the second really ubiquitous theme, I think I have a chart in here of 37 shows that revolve around issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. That is one of the principal themes of the Broadway musical in so many ways. Famous shows. Some you will immediately point to, like West Side Story or Fiddler on the Roof, but there's just, it's throughout. And then the third crucial theme, and again, affecting dozens and dozens of shows, is community, issues of community. How do we form an effective, functioning community? And what I find really interesting, especially given today where we are now, is most Broadway musicals seem to be telling us that in order to create a successful community, everybody has to give something up. Everybody has to compromise. Everybody has to meet in the middle. And and again, show after show after show. And I go through these, I analyze in the book, I give you examples all the way through of how that's true. I mean, just one brief example, I don't know how we're doing on time here, but think about Oklahoma. What is the central conflict of Oklahoma? People have trouble telling us, but anybody can tell me what is the central conflict of Oklahoma? The farmers and the cowmen, you're exactly right. The farmers represent communitarian values, and the cowboys represent basically libertarian values. Both have their point. Both have their reason to exist. And the farmers and the cowmen must be friends is like the topic sentence of that show. And it's things that you don't know when you're watching, or you don't register when you're watching it, but in the back of your head, you are figuring it out. You are knowing it, that the marriages that happen at the end of that show is a farmer woman marries a cowman twice, both couples that happens in the show, because in order to move the show forward, in order to move the story forward. And you see those marriages at the end of, whether it's the end of Guys and Dolls, all of them are symbolic marriages representing the cultures that need to come together in these shows. So I love writing about that section. It's one of my favorite things to do.
Well, now that I've exhausted all my questions, open it to the floor for any questions.
I have the mic. And I'll circulate, but I have a question.
Yeah.
How many Black performers, other than, I'm thinking about Porgy and Bess, in the golden era, because now lots of musicals with Blacks, but I don't remember it prior to now.
What's really interesting, first I'll talk about the Silver Age. My friend Cassine Gaines, who wrote a fantastic book called When Broadway Was Black, which is mostly about the show Shuffle Along, makes the point that there were more Black people on Broadway in 1926 than there are today, which we don't think. Somehow that fact has gotten mapped. But I did have a lot of fun writing about the Golden Age of Broadway and looking at what changed, and for the worse, is after the mid-1930s, very few Black songwriters, playwrights, directors, or choreographers had any opportunity anymore. But performers had a lot of opportunity, and I detail that throughout the Golden Age. There are not only stars who became stars in shows like Pearl Bailey and Sammy Davis Jr., people like that, but shows, significant shows with black cast and black stories that were still happening during that period. So it's more than you think.
Peter has a question.
Thank you, David, for that book. I wish it was a talking book because I can't read very well anymore. But
It will be. We're working on that.
Oh,
so
good.
I don't have a date for you. So but
sign me up, please.
Yeah.
So when did the characters, the actors who might be black or Asian or white or something in between or who knows what, when did it stop being the case that they had to, that they could just play any character? They weren't a black person necessarily an Asian person. Asian person might be playing a white person. When did that begin to evolve?
I mean, it's a really interesting and a complicated subject, but I'll give you one really fascinating example, especially for today, is the first black woman to win a Tony Award is Juanita Hall, who plays the character Bloody Mary in South Pacific. She's the first. She then, the next year, played a black woman in a show called, it'll come to me in a minute. And then she also plays the mother figure in Flower Drum Song. She plays a Chinese character and wins a Tony Award again. So Juanita Hall is one of these incredible, great performers. We've all heard her sing. She also plays Bloody Mary in the movie, although it was 10 years later by then, so they dubbed her voice with the woman who was playing it in London at that time, because her voice had aged a little bit by that point. But you see her also in the movie A Flower Drum Song. And it's to your point, we've gotten to a place now where it feels like people are very adamant that people be exactly what they are and when they're cast in a show. And part of that came out of a good place, but I think it also, personally, these are actors, and the job is to act, and you should be able to play all manner of all kinds of parts. And I think we're heading back in that direction at this point.
I remember in the late 1960s, I saw Man of La Mancha on Broadway. And the lead role was played by a Japanese singer. Mm-hmm. And he had a fantastic voice.
Yeah.
You never mentioned Stephen Sondheim. Where do you think he fits, and has he been good for the stage, for musicals?
Absolutely. And in fact, the centerpiece of my book, which I just skipped over it. There's a lot I had to skip over, obviously. You didn't hear the question? The question is, I'd never mentioned Stephen Sondheim. Sorry, I should repeat the questions. Thank you for asking me. Yeah. So the centerpiece of the book is, I sort of call it the intermission of the book. And it talks about what I call are these legacy chains. The musical theater is like a medieval craft. It is handed down from one person to the next, individually over a century. And you can trace some of these, what I call legacy chains in that regard. In the center of the book, I trace the legacy chains that starts with a man named Otto Harbach, who is a name you may not know. He wrote a lot of very famous songs and very famous shows. If you've ever heard the song Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, Otto Harbach wrote the lyrics to Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. He was employed by Oscar Hammerstein II's uncle, who was a very successful producer on Broadway. And Oscar Hammerstein is a young man in his teens and 20s at this point, and he wants to be in the theater. He wants to get involved against his own father's objections. And his uncle matches him up with Otto Harbach, and they write a whole series, a whole decade or more of shows together with Harbach teaching and mentoring Oscar Hammerstein, who then very famously becomes the mentor of Stephen Sondheim. And literally, Sondheim meets Oscar Hammerstein when he's a kid, when he's a young man, and has to escape his own family and ends up at Oscar Hammerstein's house. And Sondheim always said, if Oscar had been an archaeologist, I would have been an archaeologist. He just happens to be a musical theater writer. So literally, Hammerstein gives a course to Sondheim on how to write a musical. Then very famously, Sondheim, because of that, is very, very giving to young artists who come after him, most notably Lin-Manuel Miranda, and who was very instrumental in helping him and advising him and guiding him. So between these four people, Harbach, Hammerstein, Sondheim, and Miranda, we trace the entire history of the Broadway musical in four individuals. So Sondheim is is one of the most significant people. I mean, that's why I present him at the center of the book, and he's throughout the book, but he absolutely is a central figure in the history of Broadway. He's also gay, and he's also Jewish. He's not black.
What is the essential difference between a Broadway musical and an opera? Like, for example, hasn't Showboat now being presented in the opera?
So there are musicals that will get produced by opera companies. Showboat is one that is often done by opera companies. Sweeney Todd is done as in opera companies quite frequently. Porgy and Bess, I actually think, is an opera. And that has a lot of elements that are sort of, it's one of those hybrid things, sort of, it's indefinable, I guess. But for me, I'll tell you what I think the difference is. An opera is driven by that. I mean, the controlling person in an opera is the composer. And all the values of an opera are about the music. Everything else, the words, whatever words there are, whatever story is in service of the music. The driving force of a musical is usually the word people. Even though we remember the music and we'll say it's a Richard Rodgers musical or it's a Cole Porter musical, we'll talk about the composer. Most of the time, the initiator and the people driving the bus, basically, are the lyricist and the book writer. And the music is in service of the story and the words. For me, that's the main difference. I'm sure there are exceptions to that as we go on. Porgy and Bess is one of those, which one is it? I think it leans a little more on the music than it does on the words in many cases, but then it has those great musical theater songs like I Got Plenty of Nothing and A Woman Is a Sometime Thing, all that kind of stuff. So, but for me, that's what it is. It's who is the central figure with the most power in the room, and Puccini is the one in the opera, or whatever opera composer. It's the composer that is the central force behind it. And I think the opposite with a musical, even though the music, even though the composer still gets all the credit.
Where does
Dan, microphone.
Where does Phantom of the Opera fit?
It's very interesting because I do think Andrew Lloyd Webber is one of those exceptions I was just talking about. I do think he is the controlling factor, especially in his later shows. By the time we get to Phantom, he is the one driving it, and it maybe is, even though the music has pop elements to it, in some ways I do think of his shows as being sort of more in the opera camp than in the musical theater camp, although opera people would not agree with that probably. Over here's got
Okay, David, go back to South Pacific and the racism that's involved in there. I have played Bloody Mary probably at least 10 times in the Portland area.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite roles, and I love it. But I've always been disturbed with "You've Got to Be Taught to Hate and Fear," the song.
So tell me why you're disturbed by it, because
Well, and now sometimes they're not doing that song.
actually, here's an interesting if they're doing it, if they're not doing it, they could be closed down because
I would think so too.
well, Rodgers and Hammerstein, who sold off the company, but the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization, which recently sold all of their things to a company called Concord Music. Like so many things today, it gets, things get bought up and they cashed out basically, the sons and daughters of Rodgers and Hammerstein. But they wrote in the contract that song can never be cut from any production of.
I've actually been to performances where they have cut it.
Yeah, so they were
Very
illegal.
bothersome.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole show revolves around that song, and I tell some stories in the book that at the time people objected to that song. That especially when they're out of town in Boston with the show before it came to New York, people were coming, well, why do you have to talk about that stuff? Why do we have to talk about racism? Why do we have to do that? And there's a letter that Hammerstein sent to somebody. He wrote a lot of letters saying, we would rather not do the show at all than cut that song from the show. So they were adamant. That was what the show was about. The novel, the James Misher novel, all the stories revolve around issues of racism and racial prejudice, and they chose those particular stories to make the musical about. That's what they intended to do.
David, how is the Jews came play such a huge role in their life on Broadway?
So the question was, how did the Jews come to play such a role? This is really fascinating. There would be no Broadway musical if it wasn't for the open immigration policies of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Because, and it's a complicated story, but there hundreds of millions of German Jewish immigrants first came to America, then Russian Jewish, Eastern European immigrants came to America in this period, and including people like Irving Berlin, who comes to America. I think he's the most amazing story. He arrives in America at 9 years old, speaking no English, speaking only Yiddish, maybe a little bit of Russian. He doesn't go past the third grade, maybe, even if he went that far. He grows up on the streets of the Lower East Side. He's one of those newsboys. He's like in Newsies. As a kid, he runs away from home because his father dies, and he runs away so his mother doesn't have to support him anymore, and lives on the streets basically, and ends up inventing American culture. Just think about 3 songs he wrote: Easter Parade, White Christmas, and God Bless America. Those are just 3 of hundreds of songs that he wrote. He ends up inventing American culture and is so creative. And he writes the music and the lyrics. He can't read a note of music, never could, and can only play the piano in one key. And yet he is this incredible force. But part of it is because, and the reason, and it's the same issue for all the people in the title of this book, is show business emerges. I started talking about that earlier. And there's this need for, everybody wants to go see these shows again, we're talking about the turn of the century. They want vaudeville. There's this need for entertainment in this urban environment. There's never been an urban environment before, but all of a sudden, New York City has just become this incredible population that's happened there. But nice people won't be in show business. No, white people, nice white Protestant people will not be in showbiz. They might go see it, but they would die before they would appear on the stage, because it's these Puritan values that we come from. So it opened the door to people who couldn't get into anything else. They now had an opportunity to be in show business. If they had the talent, this was a door that was open to them when they literally couldn't get into any other lines of work. So that's why Jewish people are so important. Now, it happens to be that these cultures, the German culture and the Russian culture, and Irish is another part of this. I talk a lot about the Irish immigrants in here, because they're at the bottom of the pecking order. The Irish immigrants are the lowest of the low in many cases at this time. No Irish Need Apply was still happening into the 1920s. And so they had the same thing. And because Irish had this incredible musical and theatrical culture to draw on, and Jewish people had this incredible culture, Irving Berlin, Harold Arlen, Al Jolson are all the sons of cantors, which is not just a coincidence. It's because the Jewish music becomes and then a fascinating part that I loved researching was it is too long to go into, but the Jewish music sounds an awful lot like African American music that's emerging at the same period that's come out of slavery. And the black people hear the Jewish music and it sounds familiar to them, and the Jewish people hear the black music and it sounds familiar to them. And those two things come together to create, number one, jazz, and number two, the Broadway show tune. So it's the colliding of these two cultures that make this, and it's a mutual admiration society that makes it happen.
Who did win the Tony Award, The Music Man or West Side Story? Being that not up to that Tonys.
The Music Man won the Tony Award and ran about 4 times as long, and in fact, West Side Story was a hit. It was a big hit show on Broadway, but it didn't become the thing that it is in our culture until the movie came out about 5 years later. That's what really, because when it first came out, the music was too harsh for many people. The story was too astringent. There were a lot of people who did not like West Side Story when it first came out. It was still a hit. That's why some people will say it flopped. It did not flop. It was a big, significant hit, but it really wasn't. By the time we got to the movie coming out, all of a sudden everybody got on the bus with it. Got one. Leonard Bernstein wrote the music for West Side Story. Yes, absolutely.
We have time for one more question, please.
I'm glad that you brought up the thing about Leonard Bernstein, because it synthesizes a lot of stuff that makes what you're saying very valid. Leonard Bernstein came to a point where he did not think the music of West Side Story was worthwhile enough, because it was all sung and performed by non-formally trained music students.
By dancers mostly, yeah.
Right. And so he decided he was going to cure that and see what happens when you do it with real musicians. And he hired Kiri Takanawa, a couple of Italian...
Jose Carreras, I think.
Right, and Marilyn Horne. And they put together a long-playing record with strict music as defined by Leonard Bernstein. That album is probably the all-time losing album of sales and the most boring music you could hear.
The tempos are so slow and stodgy. I remember that album very well when it came out. Personally, Leonard Bernstein wrote some of the greatest Broadway musicals of all time, but he spent most of his career conducting an orchestra. And I wish he had written 3 more Broadway musicals and conducted his orchestra less, because that's what will live on forever. But he did what he did.
Well, David, thank you for a very entertaining evening.
Thank you so much, everybody. Really fun. I loved it.
Sally has a few closing words.
Yes, I have a few closing words. I also would like to ask, excuse me, pardon me, we aren't through yet. I also would like to ask you, I know you brought some of your books, and would you like to say what gold you would like for those?
Sure, absolutely. I do have books. I have mostly the paperback version, which I'm happy to sell at a little discount for $30. And there's also, I have two of the hardback versions, which I can go for $90. So no pressure in any way. But if anybody's interested in the book, I'll be happy to sell it to you. I have a little credit card thing, and we can make it work.
And he'll also autograph it.
I will definitely sign them for you. Absolutely.
Okay, I want to close with a quote from Martin Luther King about a beloved community. This is the last week of February, which is Black Month. And Martin Luther King said, "The aftermath of violence is bitterness. The aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of a beloved community, so that when the battle is over, a new relationship comes into being. The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. This is the love that may well be salvation of our civilization." And I see Horizon House, I see the arts community as beloved communities that are here for all of us. And here in Horizon House, we have a beloved community that respects each other, cares for each other, and works together all the time. And I just wanted to honor our beloved community. I see my job is to maintain it and pay it forward. And I thank you all, and we will stay as long as you need to talk to our wonderful speaker. And thank you for your beloved community of art that you have had such an important role in. We're delighted, Mr. Armstrong.